Marketing and Entrepreneurship, a podcast by Into the Minds, marketing agency in Paris and Brussels.
I actually achieved the quantity of content. Really, there's three factors: having a good process, having a good team, and perseverance.
Welcome to this new episode of Marketing and Entrepreneurship. Today I'm with David Shriner-Cahn, a fellow podcaster from New York who has broadcasted more than 500 episodes of his series Smashing the Plateau and has just launched a new series, Going Solo. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much, Pierre-Nicolas.
Can you first tell us a little bit about your podcast?
Sure. So the mission behind the podcast is helping entrepreneurs and professionals navigate transitions successfully, particularly in an age of accelerating complexity like we're facing right now. And the reason behind that is when I started the podcast, I noticed there was a lot of content, whether it's podcasts or other media, there's a lot of content that deals with startups. And the reality is for most business owners, they spend very little time starting something up. They spend most of their time running something. And I have a long background in operations. So most of the work that I've done with clients is helping them with their operations, helping them implement a plan over a long period of time, constantly iterating on the plan and trying to generate long-term success. Because what do most business owners want? They want to work less, make more money, spend less money on mistakes, and they want to make more money over time. And that's really been the focus of everything that we've done in our business, and it's also the focus of the podcasts.
So what was your motivation? You said, well, I'm an entrepreneur myself. What was your real motivation to start a podcast in 2014? That's more than 6 years ago that you started Smashing the Plateau.
Yeah, so the reason why we started the podcast, it actually was a pivot on what we were doing in a text-based blog. We started a blog in 2012. And one of the things that we did with the blog from day one, it was very smart in hindsight, but the reality was it was totally by accident. We started with a schedule. From day one, we were producing posts on the schedule. We started off with 2 posts a week. And then after about a year, we increased to 5 posts a week. So we were posting every day, Monday through Friday on a schedule. And the way we created the volume of content was a lot of the posts were interviews, text-based interviews. So I reached out to my network and I sent out a few hundred emails and I said, we're going to be doing these interviews in our blog over the next bit of time. If you're interested in being interviewed, let me know. I'll send you 5 questions and then we'll post your answers. And we did that and we got increased traffic. The audience got bigger. We got some good feedback. And what we heard from the audience was they wanted greater depth. And so we decided to try audio interviews as a way to create greater depth.
So you abandoned the blog?
In the beginning, we were actually doing both. So we started off with 1 podcast episode a week, and we continued so the podcast was like 1 blog post, and then we continued with 4 other text-based posts. So we were still producing the same sort of frequency of content. And then we shifted to 2 podcast episodes per week because I discovered that I was connecting with a lot of really great guests and had a backlog of guests that I wanted to be able to feature. We got really good at the podcast production process. And so I found that I was able to produce more podcast content without a huge increase in the number of hours that it took me to do it. So then we decreased the number of just written posts. We were still producing for quite some time 5 posts a week. So it was then 2 podcast episodes and 3 blog posts. And after a while, I just found that for me, the podcast was more enjoyable and was producing, I guess, more of the kinds of results I was looking for than the text-based blog posts. So we stopped doing the text-based blog posts and just did the podcast.
That's a question that I often get is, well, I have a blog, I want to do podcasting. Is there some way to combine both, or should I just leave the blog away and concentrate on the podcast, don't you think you would have been even more successful running the blog on the one hand and also the podcast on the other hand?
Well, it depends on your definition of success. So I know someone who is really good at marketing content, is in a different sector than we're in, but he has a podcast. He has a YouTube channel with all kinds of content. He sends his podcast out, not just through the podcast distribution mechanisms. He also sends them out through broadcast radio. And he has some interesting ways of actually getting the content out beyond just the podcast. He's really good at repurposing it in lots of different ways. And yes, you can do that and it will grow your audience. Again, it depends really on what you're looking to do. If your goal is just to get more ears and eyes on the content, then yes, you can use multiple channels to grow the number of ears and eyes that absorb what you're producing. If your goal is to create deep connections with people in a narrow niche, then I don't know that you necessarily need to go so wide in terms of the number of channels. That's my personal opinion, and that's depends on how you define success.
Well, success for me is like traffic and being found through organic search. That's success for me.
Yeah. So then if that's success, then I would say go wide, go to as many channels as possible. Just try to find easy ways to repurpose the content that you're already producing.
Was it actually difficult for you like 6 years ago to start that podcast from a technical viewpoint? It was still relatively new at that time. It's still very new in Europe. How did you cope with the technical details and how did you start it?
The technical details were not so hard for me. I have an engineering background. I started my career as an engineer, so I'm pretty good with technology, even though I haven't actually practiced engineering in decades. So that part wasn't hard. The hardest part was actually the feeling comfortable behind the mic, because it was something I'd never done before. And I agonized over how I would sound and whether I was good enough. And the reality is, when it comes to content creation, this is something that I've learned. If you're not embarrassed by the first time you release something, you waited too long.
Okay, interesting lesson. So you have produced more than 500 episodes. How did you achieve this? And what does it mean in particular in terms of coordination? How do you promote them? How do you find your guests? Are there still guests or interesting people who want to be interviewed by you after 500 episodes?
In terms of how do I actually achieve the quantity of content, really there's three factors: having a good process, having a good team, and perseverance. So with anything that you're doing repeatedly, you really need to find your process. And the more refined your process is, the easier it's going to be. So it took us a few months to kind of develop a process. And then once we had a process, we just continued to refine it. And so over several years, one of the things that I look to do is to automate any component that could easily be automated. So as an example, once we approve somebody to come on as a guest, it takes me less than 60 seconds to send them an email with a link to all the information they need to prepare themselves to be a guest and to send us the information that I need to prepare for the interview. That's something that initially was very manual and took a long time and took multiple people. And now it's all automated and literally it takes me less than 60 seconds. And we have a virtual assistant who does a small piece that also just takes a few minutes once the information's been submitted. So that's the process. And then team, we do have a team. One of the things that I've learned over time is I need to focus on what I'm good at and figure out who can be good at the pieces that I personally either don't want to do or I'm not good at, and how do I find reliable people who can produce quality results at a fair price. And that has taken time. So team is important. And then perseverance. So it does take a certain amount of mental fortitude to keep doing the same thing over and over again for so long. So we have not missed a week of releasing content in 6 years. And luckily with podcasting, if you plan ahead, you can set things up so that when it's time for episodes to get released, they get released automatically. So it's not that I necessarily am spending time every single day or every single week doing podcast work. I try to batch what I do. There are times when I go away or I'm busy with other things that if I know ahead of time, I can plan it and set the systems up so the systems work automatically, or one of my team members can take care of things. But it does take perseverance to decide you want to do this for a long period of time. And podcasting or any other kind of content creation generally is a long-term success. It's not something that's going to happen quickly. So you have to have the patience to do this for many months before you start to see something that seems like it's good results.
So is that perseverance or is that resilience? Because, well, the difference for me is resilience is you go through difficulties and sometimes you feel disappointed by the results. Do you see a difference? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's both. It's a good question, Pierre Nicholas, and I think it's both. I think it's both perseverance and resilience.
And how do you promote your episodes?
We've done used various techniques over time. We have gone from sending weekly emails to a subscriber list. There have been periods of time when we haven't done any kind of email marketing of the podcast. We post on social media. The channels where I'm present are LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. So every time there's a new episode, I will post on those 3 channels. Sometimes we'll post multiple times. Sometimes we'll just post once. Those 2 methods are probably the most prominent methods. And then people do find the podcast through organic search.
Is there an influence or an impact of having a renowned guest?
In terms of awareness of the episode?
Exactly, yeah.
Actually, I have found that the inverse is true. So the more, quote unquote, influence the guest has, the less likely they are to share it with their audience. I've found that people who are not big influencers and are desiring to have the platform and to have the opportunity to be a guest on a podcast are the best at promoting it.
Okay, that's curious because, well, usually people who are already known, they want to be even better known. So that would not be that difficult for them just to share the episode and to attract a lot of listeners, right?
Yep, but that has not been my experience.
So what is the business model behind your podcast? Do you generate revenues with ads or any other kinds of revenues?
So for me, the business model, or maybe a better way to talk about it, is like, what does success look like for me as a podcaster? I see it as a really great relationship building tool. Like, as an example, you and I probably would not have met had it not been for our 2 podcasts.
That's true.
And we met through, you sent me a message on LinkedIn and I responded and we had a little back and forth. And it seemed to me like it was a deeper conversation and maybe you'd be open to spending some time speaking about it. And we had a very long conversation as a result. And that's now led to us being guests on each other's podcast. So to me, relationship building is probably the biggest outcome. I have developed relationships with all kinds of people all over the world that I never would have met without the podcast. So that to me is number 1. Number 2 is actually a great learning opportunity for me. And I have gotten to know what's going on in the world in my sector, which is entrepreneurship, in a way that I hadn't really been able to do before the podcast. If I like to think about it, like I look at somebody like Terry Gross, who here in America is the host of the long-running show Fresh Air. She is an expert on popular culture, and she's an expert on popular culture because she's interviewed thousands of people on popular culture. Just interviewing people makes you an expert on something. It's really quite remarkable. And then in terms of like actual business, I find that just the ability to create greater awareness about me and my business and greater credibility for the business is very valuable. Whether leads actually come through the podcast or not, people see the podcast and it creates instant credibility in a way that just wasn't there before the podcast. That's sort of like bigger picture, not necessarily direct monetization. And then in terms of direct monetization, we do get some sponsorship income and we get some affiliate income. It's not huge. Most podcasters don't make a huge amount of money from the podcast. I'd love for it to be more. Then, that's something that I'm hoping we're able to do a better job of in the future. But I find that the other aspects of the podcast have actually been really valuable to me and to my business. So I'm perfectly happy with the podcast has already generated.
So this being said, as you know, podcast is still an emerging format in Europe and And many people wonder whether this is worth the effort, although it doesn't cost that much to produce. What would you tell them based on your experience?
I think you really need to be clear on what success means to you. Identify what the metrics are, write them down, and then have those metrics as your guide and periodically look at how you're doing in relationship to those metrics, like you would with any other business metric.
That is interesting because that's something that I've never done before. So as you know, I've had that blog for almost 15 years now, and I did miss some publications. I must admit, you haven't missed any. Good for you. I did miss a few of them, and I never actually looked at traffic or KPIs or anything like this until very recently, like 3 or 4 years ago. And my impression is if I had done that, I would have been very disappointed and probably I would have abandoned everything that I had done before. So on the one hand, I do understand that you need to focus on the KPIs and you need to have your definition of success. On the other hand, sometimes I just wonder whether the fun that you get out of interviewing people, of meeting virtually other people, especially right now in that period of crisis, isn't that the biggest reward that one can achieve?
It is for me, so that's why I'm happy doing it. I will continue to do it.
So you have interviewed hundreds of entrepreneurs in your Smashing the Plateau series. What have you learned from them?
Entrepreneurship is hard work. Running a business is much harder than being an employee. Another thing that I've learned is, which is what led to the second podcast, Going Solo, there are an increasing number of highly talented professionals that are going from employment to entrepreneurship. Certainly here in the US, I think it's worldwide. They're going into entrepreneurship later in their career, and very often it is triggered by job loss. So somebody who works in corporate for 20 to 30 years or more, who is really good at what he or she does, and then something happens, often it has nothing to do with the person's performance. It could be there's a change in the market. There's a merger or acquisition. There's a new manager who wants to show off that he or she is cutting costs. And suddenly that person's out of a job. And particularly when you're over the age of 50, and if your compensation is high, it's really hard to find another job. And the reality is a lot of those people are tired of being an employee. They would rather have more control over what they do, more control over their time, more control over the kind of work that they do, yet they have never run a business. So they might be really good in their individual skill set. So they could be a good marketing strategist, or they could be really good at communication and publication and public relations, or good at business strategy, yet they've never had to market and sell themselves as a business owner. And it's very different. I've learned that this is actually a big need. I don't see a lot of people talking about this as a major issue. People are living longer, they're working longer. Financially, they often need to work longer. They may not need to earn the same level of income when they're age 70 as they had to earn when they were 50 and they had kids at home or whatever, but they want to be doing meaningful work. They want to be getting paid what they're worth, and figuring out how to do that is really hard. So I've learned that this is a big challenge, I think, for individuals and for our economy. And if I can help identify some ways in which people can make this transition more easily, I'm happy to do it, which is why I started the second podcast, Going Solo.
Do you think that people miss a certain skills when they're going solo, when they go from being an employee to being an entrepreneur?
Yeah, there are skills that they never had to learn. So as an example, technology is a big one. Like a lot of people, you work in a corporation, there's a department that handles technology. You have a problem, somebody will come and fix it. When you're working on your own as a consultant or a coach or solopreneur in some way, you're every department. You're the tech department. You're the human resources department. A lot of these people have never had to hire anybody. And you can't run a business, even if you're a single person consultant, you still need a team for certain things. You don't need necessarily full-time employees, but you need people to help you. Like you and I both host podcasts. I have people that are part of my team, my podcast team. They're not employees, but they're part of my team. They perform work on a regular basis. And knowing how to hire how to recruit, hire, and supervise these people, especially in today's world where everybody's working remotely. That's a challenge for a lot of people.
Do you see a difference between people who just go solo, they become like freelancers, and those who really build massive companies who smash the plateau?
Some of them do. Some of them do. Going solo, we actually have highlighted some examples of people that have done well. There's one individual, his name is Michael O'Brien, whose episode I think went live in February or March. He was fairly high up inside corporations and started an executive coaching business. And he is actually doing better now as an executive coach financially than he was doing inside his corporation. And he was doing well inside corporations too. He talks about the strategies he used, which are, he has specific strategies that really helped him do that. A lot of people that make the transition from corporate to coaching really struggle. They struggle to get clients. They struggle to charge enough and make enough money from clients.
Would you say that they just try to survive when they have been laid off, and when they go solo, that they just try to make a living out of it, but it's not as rewarding as before?
From what I see, I think more people struggle financially than do better financially.
Thank you so much, David, for sharing that knowledge with us. And I wish you all the best with the podcast and many, many more episodes.
Thank you so much, Pierre Nicolas.
If you liked this episode of Marketing and Entrepreneurship, don't forget to subscribe. See you soon.